O'Neill organizes his first chapter as an introduction to comparative politics, answering the question, what is it? Describing the comparative method, a little bit of the history of the field of comparative politics, and then two very important parts of chapter one that you really should consider highlighting and annotating are the guiding concept and the guiding ideals within comparative politics. And we'll talk more about those two items here in a few minutes and throughout the course. And then he summarizes the chapter as well, of course. Might be helpful in the explanation of what comparative politics is to look at in terms of another political science discipline called international relations. So where international relations looks at the behaviors and relationships of states with respect to each other, therefore topics, as you would expect, would be foreign policy, war, trade, foreign aid, all of these types of engagements across the international system. Where comparative politics, however, looks within the country, looking at the domestic environment, if you will, the domestic politics. Regimes would become, therefore, topics of interest. Regimes, as we'll discuss later in the course, basically the rules of the government. The elections systems that are in play within a country. Various cultural aspects that may dominate within a country, the economic development within a country. And then after looking at several countries, being able to conduct an analysis that can similarly help us explain, describe, and ultimately predict state behaviors based on that. As long as countries exist or peoples agree to gather, we'll always have these three concepts. Politics, which is the representation of varying interests. The power, which is which interest has the dominant role within the broader political environment. And then institutions, particularly within political science, is very important because those are things that seem to be so importantly valued that they change very little in terms of variance. So they're less of a variable than many of the other variables that are always present in political science. So for comparative politics, we're focusing on the politics, power, and institutions within the domestic environment of the country. Information. The comparative method really depends on cases. In other words, case studies, elements that can be analyzed. For our purposes, that would be countries. O'Neill's cases of comparative politics provide us a number of cases for us to look at and then to analyze. So comparative methods really depend on multiple cases with which we can compare and analyze and come up with cause and effect relationships and maybe be predictable in terms of cause and effect. An interesting picture here of a protest in Yemen that really gets its impetus from a similar protest that occurred in Tunisia. So these two cases, Yemen, if you will, and Tunisia, provide us a bit of a similar reaction to a like issue. So in this sense, you could conduct a comparison of Yemen and Tunisia, which would be a very, very narrow case set. But nonetheless, you could. And that gets at the methodology or the purpose of the comparative method. So the comparative politics analyst could use two different methodologies for demonstrating cause and effect or causal relationships, and then to test a theory. The first is inductive reasoning, where the analyst begins with a large number of cases, analyzes them, and identifies a general trend or theme on which he or she can base an hypothesis. Whereas deductive reasoning begins with the hypothesis and then tests it by applying it to various test cases. So, for instance, a comparative analyst may look at democracies around the world and discover in the analysis that democracies generally do not go to war against each other. So the hypothesis that's generated in inductive reasoning in this case is just that democracies generally do not go to war against each other. Using deductive reasoning, the analyst would begin with that hypothesis, thinking that democracies do not go to war against each other, and then apply that hypothesis to a number of test cases. The comparative analyst would obviously want to build confidence in his or her analysis. So there are a number of different approaches that could be used. Typically, a qualitative study has a limited number of cases, but there's an in-depth investigation within each of the cases that is generally exhaustive and provides sufficient information and analytical data on which the analyst can be confident in the hypothesis. Quantitative studies would look broadly over many cases and build confidence from that broader approach using the statistical data associated with a large number of cases. And then there are ways that the comparative method and frankly social and political science in general is really challenged by the difficulty in controlling variables, very much unlike the hard sciences where there are tremendous constants and very rigid cause and effect relationships. Not so in the social science, political science. So there's difficulty in not only the number of variables, but controlling them within an analysis. Multi-causality is associated with that, variables that are impacting and changing cause and effect. Endogeneity is a challenge where we're not really sure if the cause is actually the effect and vice versa. Data gathering limitations, you can imagine the challenge within social science, political science, and just gathering data. And then area studies to date seem to overemphasize particular regions, and that'll come out as you look at our case book, O'Neill's compendium, that there's a lack of a broader approach in area studies. And of course, there's always the ever-present selection bias where you're convinced that democracies never go to war with each other, and that taints your analysis and biases the effort. And frankly, some of the latest studies on that do challenge that hypothesis. O'Neill offers a pretty interesting history of comparative politics, and it is just that. It's interesting. Some of the earlier comparativists are listed here, and probably the more important takeaway is what's going on in the more modern era, modernization theory, which is generally democratization, behavioral revolution, and then critiques on the field in general are offered by O'Neill in his first chapter. mentioned earlier the importance of a fundamental understanding of institutions, political institutions certainly, but institutions in general. I already mentioned the challenge with variables and how things can change within even the domestic environment of a country. When there are items or elements within a domestic environment that don't change as easily as others, that's really important and actually very valuable for the political science analyst, comparative politics analyst. And so that is another way of describing institutions. Institutions are really valued for their own sake, and they are very much resistant somewhat to change. Or when they do change, it becomes a significant event. So those are a bit of constants within our analysis, political institutions. And there are formal institutions and informal institutions. And the next slide will have a couple of examples of those. But they do tend to vary from country to country. Once again, institutions, particularly political institutions, are those elements of a domestic environment that are not normally frequently changing. And some examples of formal and informal institutions are listed here. Citizenship, of course, electoral systems, we'll talk a lot about further in the course. Federal versus unitary systems, how much of a central government divests power or not. Those types of arrangements are fairly rigid. I'd also add constitutions are formal institutions, and then what's associated with them typically are some of the frameworks, not particularly the government institutions, but the frameworks and the rules associated with them. And we'll talk more about that as we get to, particularly we get to the discussions on democracies. Informal institutions, as you can see listed there, those things that are not rigidly written, but they're norms. Classic is listed as the U.S. Senate's filibuster. That particular norm, institution exists nowhere formally, but it is something that has always existed in the institution of the U.S. Senate. Societal rules and culture also typically will have informal institutions that are, as mentioned earlier, the second really important mention in O'Neill's first chapter is this discussion on freedom and equality. And as O'Neill describes it, freedom versus equality. So it's important to know what we mean by these two terms because throughout the course, we will routinely come back to this tension between freedom and equality, particularly when we get to the political economic discussion in Chapter 4. But let's first define what we mean by these two terms. Freedom, I think, is fairly intuitive, the ability of an individual to act independently and to pursue whatever pursuits he or she desires, to achieve, to excel, and to fail if that's the outcome. And then that outcome is what is left for that individual to contend with. That outcome is what the society deals with, what the society accepts. And most societies won't allow abject poverty and extreme wealth to coexist. There is some balance. And so this is where we start talking about equality, where a society, a country, a state, decides that there are things that can be done to at least attempt at a level playing field and an equality not of equal under the law, but equality of condition. particularly economic condition, material condition, to where there's a more of a level playing field and there's a narrower gap, if you will, between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. And so for a country in its domestic politics to pursue such an outcome invariably impacts on the other side of the equation, and that is freedom. And so this tension exists within discussions on state power, within discussions on government, within discussions, as earlier mentioned, political economy. And so you'll see terms of freedom and equality or challenges with respect to freedom versus equality throughout governments, particularly social democratic regimes or social democratic ideologies, where the government takes deliberate measures to achieve some semblance of equality. Of course, the bill payer for that is freedom. In other words, an individual will have to agree to give up something to assist in the broader good of leveling the playing field and achieving some equality. So this concept or this guiding ideal is really important for us to understand right up front because we will come back to it routinely throughout the course and throughout the study of comparative politics. Fairly difficult to change. So some examples of institutions. Looking at human nature and what we know of human nature and behavior as building confidence in an analysis as well. Game theory and rational choice are typically those types of approaches, that analysis.